There is a glass case in Oxford, England, in a room of the Ashmolean Museum, where the light falls quiet and cool. And in that case, there is a small clay object, no larger than your hand. It is a four-sided prism, pale buff and brown, the colour of old riverbank, and it stands perhaps 8 inches tall, 4 inches across, resting on a small metal support, the way museum objects do when they are too important to lay flat. Each of the 4 sides is covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay by a reed stylus somewhere around 1800 BCE in the city of Larsa, in what is now southern Iraq. The marks are cuneiform. The language is Sumerian. The document they form is a king list, a record of who ruled in what city and for how long. You notice the label beside the case first. It says something like weld-blundell prism, Sumerian King List, Larsa, c. 1800 BCE, clay. And then you lean in close enough to see the individual impressions in the clay, and you begin to understand that the numbers on this prism are unlike anything you have encountered in a historical document before. You are not holding a piece of furniture. You are holding 4,000 years of someone's memory of something much older. The question on the label is polite and academic. The question inside the clay is something else entirely. Put your phone down. You don't need it tonight. Let the numbers come slowly, the way they were meant to come, one at a time, in the dark, without hurry. Here is what the prism says, in the translation by the Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson, who spent a professional lifetime trying to make sense of it. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Halalgar ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings. They ruled for 64,800 years. Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibera. In Bad Tibera, Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmengalana ruled for 28,800 years. Dumuzid, the shepherd, ruled for 36,000 years. 3 kings. They ruled for 108,000 years.
Finest barley in the
and
city.
so it continues through 5 cities and 8
shekels
kings,
silver.
until the document arrives at a single sentence that is 8 words long and changes the entire register of everything that came before it. The flood swept over, and then, on the other side of that sentence, after the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, Kish became the seat of kingship. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years, 1 flood. And then the world starts again, with shorter reigns, in different cities, moving toward kings whose names appear on actual buildings, whose seals have been found in actual graves, whose histories can be verified through excavation and inscription. It reads like a civilization slowly forgetting how to live forever. That is the question at the center of this document. Not whether these kings existed, not whether the flood was real, but what a human community believed they were saying when they wrote down these numbers, and what they were trying not to forget.
The intricate
The clay
cuneiform on
holds
this
the
clay
question.
prism, though
The
difficult
number
to read,
holds the silence
details
where the
history
answer
of the
would be,
region.
if there were
May
one.
the great gods
The
look
silence
favorably
is the
upon
document.
Sumer.
The silence is what
Accept
we
our
have
humble
inherited.
offerings.
Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to follow every word tonight. This is a long walk through very old clay, and some of it will catch you, and some of it you'll drift past, and that's exactly right. The document has been waiting 4,000 years. It can wait through your sleep as well. This is for the ones who lean in close at museum labels, for the people who find themselves wondering, in quiet moments, whether the official version of ancient history is complete. Not wrong, necessarily, but perhaps abbreviated. For the readers of footnotes. For the ones who know that the most astonishing things are almost always in the footnotes. If that sounds like you, you are in exactly the right place tonight. Let your body be heavy. Let the day release you the way it always eventually does, no matter how firmly it holds on. One small thing, before we go further. Where in the world are you tonight? What hour marks your descent into sleep? Is it late where you are, or early, or somewhere in the middle of a day that simply ran out of you? I think about this often. Someone in Osaka at 3 in the morning. Someone in Lima on a Tuesday afternoon with curtains drawn. Someone in Edinburgh where it is raining, as it almost always is. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. And if tonight is the kind of night this channel was made for, a quiet tap on like is everything. That is all. Now, let's go back to the clay. Let whatever needs to rest tonight, rest. The prism will still be spinning in the morning. Patient as clay has always been patient. The prism in Oxford is not the only copy of the Sumerian King List. It is the most complete, the most famous, and the most intact. But it is one of approximately 25 surviving fragments and versions of the same document, spread across museums in Oxford, Berlin, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Baghdad. The earliest known copies date to the Ur-3 period, around 2100 BCE. The prism in Oxford dates to around 1800 BCE, which means the document was being copied and recopied across at least 3 centuries before this version was made. That matters. A document copied repeatedly by different scribes in different cities across 300 years is a document that a culture considered worth preserving. Not every text survived. The scribal schools of ancient Mesopotamia were busy places, and what they chose to teach and copy tells you something about what a society thought was important.
After the flood had swept
the Sumerian
over
King List was
and the
important
kingship
enough
had
to be
descended
taught
from
in
heaven,
scribal schools,
the kingship
written
was
in more
Kish.
than 24 copies, and carried across the collapse of at least 2 major political periods. Whatever it is not casual. The prism itself was found in a 1922 expedition to Larsa, a city in what is now the Dekar province of southern Iraq.
We need to document
Once a
this transition
significant
point
center
carefully.
of Sumerian
It doesn't
political
quite
and
match
religious
the
life.
survey data.
The expedition was funded by a British aristocrat named Herbert Weld-blundell, who had been interested in archaeological exploration of the ancient Near East. He donated the prism to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford in 1923, where it remains today, catalogued as AN 1923.444. Here is a detail the exhibit label doesn't usually dwell on. The prism originally had a wooden spindle running through its center, a vertical hole that allowed the entire object to be rotated on its axis, so that all 4 sides could be read in sequence without picking it up. Someone designed this object
The prism
to be spun.
was designed to be
Someone
spun
wanted
on
the
this
reader
spindle,
to turn it in
allowing
their
the reader
hands,
to
or
examine
to spin
each
it
of the
on
4
its stand,
faces in sequence.
moving through the columns in order, city by city,
Moving through
king
columns,
by king,
city by
number
city,
by number.
king by
the format
king,
is not
number
incidental.
by number.
It is a document that invites rotation. It insists on being read from every angle. The Sumerian language itself presents its own set of challenges. Sumerian was spoken in the region of modern southern Iraq, roughly from 3500 BCE until around 1800 BCE, when it was gradually displaced as a spoken language by Akkadian, but it continued as a written and liturgical language for another 2,000 years, the way Latin remained the language of European scholarship and the Catholic Church long after anyone grew up speaking it. The scribes who wrote the King List in 1800 BCE were, in a sense, already working in a dead or dying language. They were preserving something they considered too old and too important to translate. Thorkild Jacobsen, the Danish-American Assyriologist who produced the first comprehensive scholarly translation of the King List in 1939, spent most of his professional career at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, working with the cuneiform tablets that American expeditions had been bringing back from Iraq since the 1920s. His 1939 work, titled simply The Sumerian King List, remains the foundation of scholarship on the document. Jacobsen was careful to note that the text was not a straightforward historical record. that it mixed mythological material with genuine historical data, but he was equally careful to resist the temptation to dismiss it entirely. He wrote about it the way a careful person writes about something that does not quite fit any category they already have. What the post-flood section of the list contains, the part after that single sentence about the water, includes names that archaeology has confirmed. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who is the hero of the oldest surviving work of literature, appears in the King List. According to the list, Gilgamesh reigned for 126 years. 126, not 28,000, not 43,000. 126 years. An extraordinary lifespan by any modern standard, but one that at least belongs to a range a human mind can hold without vertigo.
Years, the crack where all questions
Gilgamesh,
live.
126 years. The difference between that number and the numbers before the flood is the crack where all the questions live. The first dynasty after the flood is the dynasty of Kish, a city in the northern part of the Sumerian heartland, which archaeology has located and partially excavated. The kings of Kish have reigns that range from roughly 300 to 1,200 years in the King List, which are still absurd by modern standards, but are more compressed than the pre-flood figures. The dynasty after Kish is Uruk, and this is where Weld-blundell appears, Gilgamesh's father, given 1,200 years, and then Gilgamesh himself at 126. The trajectory is consistent. The numbers shrink as the list moves toward the documented historical period. By the time the list reaches kings whose names appear on actual clay seals, whose granaries have been excavated, whose bureaucratic records have been found in tell sites across the region, the reigns are in the range of normal human lifespans. The post-Diluvian section of the King List is, in its later portions, genuinely useful as a historical document. Scholars cross-reference it against archaeological finds and royal inscriptions, and it holds together reasonably well. But the pre-flood section, those 8 kings, those 5 cities, those 241,200 years, exists in a different register entirely. The 5 cities listed before the flood are not invented. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak have all been excavated. They are real places, real archaeological sites, with real stratigraphy, layers of human habitation going back millennia. Eridu, in particular, is considered by archaeologists to be one of the oldest cities in the world, with evidence of continuous occupation dating back to approximately 5400 BCE. When the King List says that kingship descended from heaven and its first seat was in Eridu, it is choosing the oldest known city in the region as the origin point. That is not random. At Eridu, archaeologists found 18 successive layers of temple construction, one built directly on top of the ruins of the last, following essentially the same architectural plan across thousands of years. 18 temples on the same sacred ground over roughly 3,000 years of continuous religious practice. The specific site where the Sumerian tradition believed the first king received power from heaven was not a myth in the archaeological sense. It was a real place with a real and very deep history of continuous human use. Whatever we make of the numbers, the document is built on a foundation of real geography. The question is what the numbers mean. The flood line, that single sentence dividing the document in two, is matched in other Sumerian texts. The Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary Sumerian creation and flood story, preserved on a tablet excavated from Nippur, describes the same events from a different angle. In that version, the survivor of the flood is named Ziusudra, the same figure who appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh as Utnapishtim, the same figure who becomes Noah in the Hebrew tradition. The Sumerian flood story predates the biblical account. Most scholars believe the biblical flood narrative draws from the Mesopotamian tradition,
Genesis,
though both may
the King
share an
List,
even older
and these
oral
administrative
source.
texts
But
all
here is
share
the
a
thing
common
that the
structural
Eridu
pattern.
Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Genesis flood narrative all share with the King List. They all use the flood as a hinge. Before the flood, things were different. After the flood, the world as we know it begins. The King List encodes that belief in the simplest possible way, not through a story, but through the numbers themselves. Before, 241,200 years. After, reigns that fit in a human life. Remember that number. 241,200 years, 8 kings, 1 flood sentence. We come back to it. Let's stay with the physical document for a moment longer, because its materiality matters. The clay used to make the weld-blundell prism came from the banks of a Mesopotamian river, almost certainly the Euphrates or one of its tributaries, which provided the fine alluvial clay that Sumerian scribes and potters used for everything from the most mundane administrative tablet to the most sacred religious text. The same clay that became bricks for temples became the medium for writing.
Observe where Jupiter
Mesopotamia,
intersects with
in
the
the
Scorpio.
3rd and 2nd
This
millennia
indicates the
BCE,
timing of the next
was a
lunar
culture
eclipse.
built from mud,
I see it now.
literally constructed from the material of its own floodplains. And the durability of that medium is one reason we know so much about Sumerian civilization compared to, say, ancient Indian or early Chinese civilization, where writing was done on materials that decay. Clay does not decay in a dry environment. It bakes harder under heat. It survives floods and fires and the collapse of buildings. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the largest collection of ancient cuneiform tablets ever found, survived precisely because the palace burned, baking the clay tablets harder than they had ever been. The fire that destroyed the library preserved it. The same is true of countless individual tablets found at sites across Mesopotamia. The cities burned, or crumbled, or were buried under new cities, and the clay lay in the darkness for 4,000 or 5,000 years, until a spade turned it over. The weld-blundell prism was probably not a prestigious object in the way that a gold crown or a carved ivory panel would have been prestigious. It looks like a scribal school exercise, and that is precisely what it may have been. The document was part of the curriculum of Sumerian scribal education, the Eduba, the House of Tablets, and young scribes copied it as part of their training. The 25 surviving fragments and versions of the King List suggest a document that was widely taught and widely reproduced, not a unique royal archive kept under guard. It was a text that every educated person in Mesopotamia was expected to know. This makes the document more interesting, not less. A text that appears in royal archives is a document that powerful people wanted to control.
With precision.
A text that appears in school curricula is a document that a culture wanted to propagate. The Sumerian King List was taught to children. Whatever it was communicating about political legitimacy, about the nature of cosmic time, about the relationship between divine and human rulers, it was something that the scribal culture of ancient Mesopotamia wanted its educated members to carry in their heads. The flood line, that single sentence that divides the document in two, deserves its own moment of attention. Translated from the Sumerian, it reads, "The flood swept over," 3 words in Sumerian. Anaginna,
The flood
the
swept
word for
over.
the flood, modified by a verb that means to pass over, to overwhelm, to cover. The original Sumerian carries a physical immediacy that the translations sometimes soften. The water did not arrive. It swept. It overwhelmed. It covered everything. And then, after the sweeping over, kingship descended from heaven again, and Kish became the seat of kingship. The document does not describe the flood. It does not name the survivor. It does not tell you how long it lasted or how much was lost. It says only that it swept over, that everything before it belongs to a different category from everything after it, and that after it, the world began again. The economy of that sentence, 3 words in Sumerian, separated by nothing from the list of numbers that precede it, is the most dramatic pause in any document I have ever encountered. And then the world begins again in Kish, and the first king of Kish is named Gishur, and he rules for 1,200 years, which is still impossible by any modern standard, but is so much smaller than 28,800 that it reads almost like relief. Gilgamesh's position in the list is worth dwelling on further. He appears in the second dynasty after the flood, the dynasty of Uruk, the city also known as Erech, which may appear in the Hebrew Bible as the city built by Nimrod. In the king list, the first king of Uruk is a man named Meskiagasha, described as the son of the sun god Utu, who entered the sea and ascended the mountains, which is a curious epitaph that suggests a life of extraordinary range and may preserve a memory of genuinely unusual events. His son Enmerkar ruled for 420 years and built Uruk. Lugalbanda, who in other traditions is Gilgamesh's father, ruled for 1,200 years. Then there is Dumuzid the fisherman for 100 years. And then Gilgamesh, whose father was a nomad, or, in some versions, a demon, who ruled for 126 years. 126 years. The difference between that number and Lugalbanda's 1200 is not just a matter of scale. It suggests a qualitative shift. Gilgamesh's story, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is precisely about mortality, about the king who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, who watched his best friend Enkidu die, who went to the ends of the earth to find the secret of immortality, and who came home empty-handed. The document that preserves the most ancient story of a human being grappling with death also gives us, in its king list, a king with an almost normal lifespan. Gilgamesh was not given 28,800 years. He was given 126. And the story he left behind is about the pain of that limitation.
The story
Maybe the
he
King
left
List knew
behind
exactly
is
what it
about
was
the
doing
pain
when
of
it
that
assigned him that
limitation.
number. One further element of the document's physical and historical context
Maybe the
deserves
King
attention:
List knew exactly
the
what
relationship
it was doing
between the
with that
King
number.
List and the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic is the world's oldest surviving work of literature. It was composed, in its earliest Sumerian form, around 2100 BCE, roughly the same period that scholars believe the King List was first compiled in written form. The two documents share a world and, in important ways, a conversation. The Epic is about a king who cannot accept mortality, who searches for immortality and does not find it. The King List is about kings who apparently had it, who ruled for 28,800 years before the flood, and then lost it when the
This is
world
the upper
changed.
section of the King List. It speaks
Together,
of rulers
they
before the
form
Great
a
Flood,
meditation on
some
the same
reigning for
question.
as long as 28,800
What was available before
years.
that is not available now. What was lost in the flood? Why does Gilgamesh, who appears in both documents, as a character in the Epic and as a king in the list, get 126 years rather than 28,000? The Epic's answer to Gilgamesh's quest for immortality is memorable. The tavern keeper Siduri tells him, in the version preserved from ancient Nippur, to eat, drink, bathe, hold a child's hand, let your wife delight in your embrace. The immortality that the pre-flood kings had
bathe,
is gone.
hold
What
a
remains
child's
is
hand.
this, the ordinary textures of a mortal life, and they are enough. The King List does not say this. It simply lists the numbers and does not comment. But if you read the two documents side by side, you understand that they are asking the same question and arriving at different places with it. The King List looks backward. Those kings had something we do not. The Epic looks forward. Given that we do not have it, what do we have instead? The King List is the question. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one answer. Both were written down around the same time, in the same language, by people who understood themselves to be living in the diminished but real world on the far side of the flood. They were making sense of their position in a cosmos that had once been vaster than it was now. The scribal schools of ancient Sumer, the Edjaba, meaning House of Tablets, were institutions of extraordinary scope and ambition. They trained not just scribes but administrators, priests, astronomers, lawyers, and physicians. The curriculum included literature, mathematics, music, botany, zoology, and law. A student who passed through the full program would have copied hundreds of texts, hymns, laments, wisdom literature, administrative formulae, and historical documents, and in doing so would have absorbed not just the content of each text, but the tradition of how Sumerian culture thought about itself. The King List was part of that curriculum. A student at the Edjaba in Nippur or around 2000 BCE would have copied it out by lamplight, pressing the wedge-shaped stylus into a fresh clay tablet, getting the numbers right, learning the names of the cities and the sequence in which the kingship moved between them. The teacher, called the school father, the Amir, would have checked the work and corrected the marks that were too shallow or wrongly oriented. The student would practice again. Think about what this means for the transmission of the tradition. Every educated person in ancient Mesopotamia, everyone who could read, which in a culture of perhaps a few million people meant perhaps a few thousand, maybe a few tens of thousands, knew the King List. Not vaguely, not as a general impression. They had copied it by hand. They had spent hours with the numbers, pressing each sar and nur into clay, thinking about the sequence, getting the cities right, understanding the structure. This is a different relationship to a text than reading it. Copying a text by hand does something to the body that reading does not. It creates a muscular memory, a physical sense of the sequence and shape of the content. Medieval monks who copied manuscripts reported that the act of copying changed how they knew the text. The same is probably true of the Sumerian scribal students who copied the King List. The numbers were not abstract to them, they were in their wrists. This means that when later Mesopotamian scholars, the Umanu, the court scholars of the Assyrian period, referenced the antediluvian kings, they were drawing on a tradition they had physically internalized. Berossus, writing his Babyloniarcha in Greek around 290 BCE, had almost certainly been educated in the Babylonian tradition of scribal scholarship, which descended in a continuous line from the Sumerian Eduba. When he recorded the 10 antediluvian kings and their 432,000 years for a Greek audience, he was transmitting something he had been taught was fundamental, something that had been pressed into clay by 10,000 hands across 2,000 years. The document's durability is not an accident. It was designed into the curriculum. The people who decided that the King List was part of what every educated Mesopotamian needed to know were making a choice about what the core of their civilization was. And for 2,000 years, give or take, that choice held. The numbers are not random. This is the first thing that becomes clear when you study them carefully, and it is the thing that changes how you read the entire document. Every single reign in the pre-flood section of the King List, all 8 of them, is a precise multiple of a unit called the sar. A sar, in the Sumerian numerical system, is 3,600, which is 60 times 60, which is the square of the base of the Sumerian counting system, which was built on 60 rather than 10. We still live in a world shaped by Sumerian base 60. You divide the hour into 60 minutes. You divide the minute into 60 seconds. You divide the circle into 360 degrees. You divide the compass into its 4 quadrants of 90 degrees. None of this is self-evident. None of it is natural. All of it traces back to Mesopotamia. The Sumerians chose 60 as their mathematical base because it is the smallest number divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The most mathematically flexible base available to anyone working with whole numbers. It made fractions easy. It made astronomical calculations manageable. It made large-scale record-keeping, the administrative heartbeat of a complex civilization, possible. So, the Sa, 3,600, and a Ner, which is 600, and a Sos, which is 60. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years is 8 Sars exactly. Alalangar's 36,000 is 10 Sars. Enmenluana's 43,200 is 12 Sars. Enmengalana's 28,800 is 8 Sars. Dumazid's 36,000 is 10 Sars. Ensipadzidana's 28,800 is 8 Sars. And then Enmendurana's 21,000 is a departure from pure Sar multiples. It uses a combination of units. And Ubartutu, the last pre-flood king, at 18,600 years, is also a mixture. Most of the reigns are perfect. They are not lengths of time someone measured by observing actual events. They are numbers someone chose, assigned, placed into a structure the way you place values into the columns of a mathematical table. The choice of the sexagesimal system is not decorative. It is the point. The numbers are communicating something about the Sumerian understanding of time and order and cosmic scale. Now hold this number, 43,200. The reign of Enmenluana, the longest in the pre-flood king list, is 43,200 years. In the Hindu tradition, the Kali Yuga, the current cosmic age, the age of moral decline that precedes the eventual renewal of the cosmos, lasts exactly 432,000 years. These numbers are a factor of 10 apart. One ancient tradition's unit of sacred time is precisely 10 times the others. This could be coincidence. It could be a shared mathematical vocabulary descended from a common tradition. It could be independent discovery of the same numerical patterns in astronomical observation. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that cycles over approximately 25,920 years, produces a related number. 25,920 divided by 60 is 432. Multiplied by 100, it is 43,000. The scholars who have noted this, including the mythologist Joseph Campbell, who spent considerable effort on such cross-cultural numerical patterns, are not claiming that the Sumerians and the ancient Indians were in direct contact, or that either tradition is literally true. They are noting that the same numbers appear in contexts of great cosmic significance across cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of independent development. The numbers themselves may carry information about astronomical cycles that multiple ancient traditions independently observed and encoded into their sacred chronologies. This is not the mainstream academic interpretation of the King List. The mainstream interpretation is much more cautious, and we will come to it. But the numbers are there, and they are precise, and they are not random, and they do not go away when you look at them carefully. They become more interesting. The shrinkage is the second anomaly, and it is in some ways the stranger one. If the pre-flood numbers are cosmically large, if they are encoding astronomical cycles or sacred mathematics, why do the post-flood numbers shrink? Why does the first dynasty of Kish have reigns in the hundreds of years rather than thousands? Why does Lugalbanda get 1,200 and Gilgamesh get 126? If the numbers are symbolic, why do they decrease so consistently as the document moves toward historical time? One interpretation: the numbers reflect a cosmological belief about the nature of time itself. In the pre-flood era, time moved differently. Kings were closer to the divine. The Apkallu, the divine advisors, the fish sages, walked beside them. The world was newer. In the post-flood era, something was lost. Not just the population and the cities, but the quality of time itself. The reigns shorten because the kings are becoming more mortal, more ordinary, more like us. The document is not describing history, it is describing a fall. Another interpretation, less mystical but equally haunting. The document is a political artifact, written at a specific moment for a specific purpose, and the numbers in the pre-flood section were designed not to be read as literal reign lengths at all, but as markers of a kind of sacred antiquity. To say a king reigned for 28,800 years was to say he came from a time so distant that no human memory could reach it, a time before measurement was possible, a time of gods and cosmic cycles. The number communicates vastness, not duration. But here is the question that the shrinkage raises. If the pre-flood numbers are symbolic, and the post-flood numbers are gradually becoming real, at what point does the document stop being mythology and start being history? When Gilgamesh gets 126 years, are we still in the symbolic register? When Gilgamesh's successor gets 30 years, are we in history? The document doesn't tell you. That is not an accident. The document lets the numbers speak for themselves, without annotation, without commentary, without footnotes. It is a list. It is a record. What you do with the record is your concern. Gilgamesh, 126 years. Keep him in mind. We'll need that number later. The translation of the Sumerian word for year is worth pausing on, because it carries layers that the English word doesn't. The Sumerian word is mu. It means year in the most basic sense, a unit of time corresponding to one solar cycle. But mu also means name. In Sumerian grammar and cosmology, the name of a thing was understood to be deeply connected to its essence. To name something was to bring it into being in a meaningful sense. The names of the gods were their powers. The name of a king was his identity as a ruler. So when the document says Alulim ruled for 28,800 mu, it is saying 28,800 years. But it is also, in a language where word and thing are intimately connected, saying 28,800 names, 28,800 cycles of the world, as named by a divine king. This is not a clean grammatical argument, and it is not the standard scholarly translation. But the word mu carries both meanings, and the scribes who used it knew both meanings, and the possibility that the document is playing on both, that a king's years and a king's namings are the same thing, is exactly the kind of layered intention that Sumerian sacred literature is known for. The units of measurement used in the pre-flood section deserve their own examination because they are not arbitrary. A sar, as we noted, is 3,600, the square of 60. But 3,600 is also the number of degrees in 10 full circles. It is the number of seconds in an hour. It is a number that appears at the intersection of astronomical and mathematical thinking. In a culture that built its timekeeping system on base 60, precisely because it wanted a number that divided cleanly into the units used to describe the sky. A ner, 600, is 1/6 of a sar. It is the number of years that a Sumerian astronomer might associate with a complete cycle of a particular planetary conjunction. The synodic period of Saturn, the time it takes for Saturn to return to the same position relative to Earth, is approximately 378 days, and the Babylonian astronomers who descended from the Sumerian tradition tracked Saturn across centuries. 600 years would encompass approximately 579 Saturnian cycles, a number that comes close enough to a round number in the sexagesimal system to have astronomical resonance. The SOS, 60, is the base unit, and 60 is embedded in every measurement system we still use. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, the 60 unit divisions of the degree. The fact that all 8 pre-flood reigns are expressible in combinations of sar, ner, and sos suggests that whoever assigned these numbers was not describing observed events. They were constructing a mathematical architecture. The pre-flood section of the King List is, on some level, a piece of sacred mathematics. The question of what the mathematics encodes is where the serious disagreement lies. Göran Friberg, a historian of mathematics at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden, who has spent decades studying Babylonian and Sumerian mathematical texts, has argued that the specific numbers in the King List are consistent with a mathematical tradition that was being taught in the same scribal schools where the King List was being copied. The numbers are pedagogically convenient. They demonstrate the SAR system. They illustrate how to work with very large sexagesimal numbers, and they do so in a context that gives the mathematics religious and historical weight. The King List on this reading is a mathematical teaching text dressed as a historical chronicle. Friberg's interpretation is not the only mathematical reading of the text. The astronomer Simo Parpola at the University of Helsinki has argued for connections to astronomical cycles. The scholar Dwight Young of Brandeis University proposed in a 1988 paper that the antediluvian numbers could be derived from a mathematical formula involving the square of the base 60 system. None of these interpretations is universally accepted. What is universally accepted is that the numbers are not random and that their structure was intentional. Now, the gradual shrinkage. The shrinkage from pre-flood to post-flood numbers is not smooth. The first dynasty after the flood, the dynasty of Kish, has reigns ranging from 140 to 1,200 years. The second dynasty, at Uruk, brings us Lugal-Banda at 1,200 and Gilgamesh at 126. By the time the list reaches the third dynasty, of Ur, the reigns are in the range of a few decades to a few centuries. By the time it reaches dynasties that can be matched against archaeological and historical records from outside the document, the numbers are in the range of normal human lifespans, or slightly extended versions of them. But the shrinkage is not uniform, and this is interesting. Some post-flood kings get impossibly long reigns. Etana of Kish is given 1,500 years in some versions, while others get quite short ones. Gilgamesh at 126 is surrounded by figures with much larger numbers. The list does not simply decrease linearly, it oscillates toward the ordinary, with occasional spikes back toward the impossible. One interpretation, different sections of the post-flood list were compiled at different times, by different scribal communities, using different traditions. The inconsistency in the numbers reflects the layered nature of the compilation, not a single continuous cosmological argument. The document that reads as a unified text on the prism may have been assembled from multiple earlier fragments, each with its own numerical conventions. Another interpretation, the spikes represent specific claims of divine ancestry. When a king gets an unusually long reign in the post-flood section, when Etana gets 1,500 years, it is because someone was making a particular argument about that king's divine connection. The post-flood section, even as it converges toward historical reality, still contains pockets of the older numerical grammar. Gilgamesh's 126 years, by this reading, is not a sign that he was being treated as an ordinary man. It is a sign that whoever compiled the Uruk dynasty's portion of the list was trying to place him in the historical record while acknowledging his legendary status. 126 years is too long for a mortal, but too short for a god. It is the number of a hero, a being who is, as the epic says of Gilgamesh explicitly, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His number splits the difference. This is the kind of precision that appears throughout the document, and that makes it impossible to dismiss as naive. Whoever made the choices embedded in the King List was making arguments with numbers, arguments about status, legitimacy, divine connection, and the boundaries between mythological and historical time. There is a detail in the construction of the pre-flood numbers that most popular accounts of the King List pass over, and that repays careful attention. All but 2 of the 8 pre-flood reigns are multiples of both 7,200 and of 3,600. The number 7,200 is 2 sars, 2 times 3,600, and its repeated appearance in the pre-flood sequence is not coincidental. In the Sumerian understanding, the number 7,200 had a specific cosmological significance. It was associated with the Great Ner, a period twice as long as the Sar, and it appears in other Sumerian mathematical and astronomical texts as a fundamental unit of large-scale time reckoning. The reigns that are multiples of 7,200, Alulim at 28,800 is 4 times 7,200. Alanga at 36,000 is 5 times 7,200. Enmenluana at 43,200 is 6 times 7,200. Enmengalana at 28,800 is again 4 times 7,200. Dumuzid at 36,000 is 5 times 7,200. Ensipadzidana at 28,800 is 4 times 7,200. The deviations, Enmendurana at 21,000 and Ubartutu at 18,600, break the pattern. By the time the list reaches the last 2 kings before the flood, something has already begun to change. The numbers are no longer round. They are still large, but they have lost the mathematical cleanness of the earlier reigns. Even within the pre-flood section, there is a sense of diminishment beginning. The total of 241,200 years is, as the Assyriologist Kasuto pointed out in the 1960s, equivalent to 1 great Shusharu, 1 very great Sar, plus 7 Sars, which is to say 216,000 plus 25,200. These are not arbitrary numbers. 216,000 is 60 to the 3rd power, the cube of 60. It is the largest sexagesimal unit that appears in Sumerian mathematical tables, and 25,200 is 7 Sars, 7 being a number of sacred significance in Mesopotamian cosmology, the 7 sages, the 7 gates of the underworld, the 7 tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the 7 days of creation in the Genesis parallel. So the total of the pre-flood period is 1 cube of 60 plus 7 times the sacred unit. This is not the kind of number you arrive at by adding up actual reign lengths. This is the kind of number you construct when you want to embed a mathematical and cosmological statement into a historical-looking document. The statement is something like, the pre-flood era was the largest possible mathematical period, the cube of the sacred base, plus 1 complete cycle of sacred sevens. It was, in other words, the full expression of the Sumerian mathematical cosmos before the flood reset it. What the reset looked like, in numbers, the first post-flood dynasty of Kish has a total of roughly 24,510 years, less than a tenth of the pre-flood total. The second dynasty of Uruk, a few thousand years. The third of Ur, a few hundred. The contraction is not gradual, it is swift and it is measured. The Sumerians knew exactly how to express the size of the loss. But what if we're reading it wrong? This is the question that Pyotr Michailovsky, one of the most respected Sumerologists working today, spent a significant part of his career exploring. Michalowski, who was Professor Emeritus at the University of Michigan, argued in a 1983 paper that has become foundational to the field that the Sumerian King List is best understood not as a historical record, but as what he called a history as charter, a document designed to establish political legitimacy by claiming ownership of the past. Think about what the document does. It says, one city rules at a time. Kingship is singular, not plural. It descends from heaven, a divine gift, and it moves from city to city as each city falls. The structure insists on sequence. First Eridu, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. And after the flood, first Kish, then Uruk, then Ur, and so on. The archaeological reality of ancient Mesopotamia was nothing like this. Multiple city-states existed simultaneously. They competed, they traded, they went to war, they had overlapping spheres of influence. Uruk and Kish were probably contemporaneous for a significant portion of the period the King List treats as sequential. The list imposes a false chronological order on what was actually a complicated, messy, politically plural landscape. Why would someone do that? Because you want to say, we are the rightful rulers. Not because we won a fight, anyone can win a fight, but because we are the inheritors of an unbroken tradition stretching back to the first city, in the first age, when kingship descended from heaven. The King List is a claim, a royal genealogy of time itself. The document was probably compiled in its early form around 2100 BCE, during the third dynasty of Ur, a period of Sumerian political revival and consolidation, when the kings of Ur were trying to reassert Sumerian cultural prestige against Akkadian influence. To commission a document saying that one city rules at a time, in an unbroken line from the gods, is to make a statement about power. This interpretation is not speculative. Michalowski noted that the document specifically omits dynasties that competed with the cities it includes. The city of Lagash, which was one of the most important and well-documented cities of the early dynastic period, is missing from the King List almost entirely. We have extensive records from Lagash. We know many of its kings. The King List doesn't think they matter. They were rivals. They don't get to be part of the lineage. This interpretation, while not the only one held by mainstream scholarship, changes the nature of what we are looking at. The King List is not a failed history. It is a successful political argument, dressed in the language of antiquity. But, and this is where it gets complicated, even a political argument has to work. Even a document designed to establish legitimacy has to reference things its audience recognizes as real. You can't claim descent from a tradition that your audience knows is entirely invented. The pre-flood kings had to mean something to the people who first read this document, or the claim would be hollow. The 241,200 years were not a number pulled from nowhere. They were a number that communicated something the audience recognized and accepted as a valid description of a period that preceded living memory. The safety valve, placed here where it belongs. None of this means the kings were literal beings who lived literal 28,800-year reigns. The mainstream view of scholars who work with this document is that the pre-flood section belongs to a mythological framework, not a historical one. The numbers are symbolic. The kings may be cultural memories distilled into names, and the flood is a narrative device. This is the scholarly consensus, arrived at through decades of careful work. What the scholarly consensus does not do is explain why the numbers are what they are, and not something else. It does not explain why they shrink so consistently, or why they align so precisely with sexagesimal mathematics, or why similar traditions of decreasing lifespans appear in Genesis, and in Vedic literature, and in Greek mythology. The consensus tells you what the document is not. It is somewhat quieter about what the document is. And the most honest answer available, perhaps, is that it is both things simultaneously. It is a political charter, and a mathematical puzzle, and a cosmological argument, and a distorted memory of real cities, and a genuine attempt to describe something that happened before human writing could record it. It is all of these at once. The scribe who pressed these marks into wet clay in 1800 BCE inherited layers he could no longer fully explain, and he passed them on. Let's step away from the document itself for a moment. Let's look at what accompanied the first kings, the beings who stood beside them, whose presence perhaps explains why those reigns were so long. The school text interpretation, Michalowski's reading of the document as political charter and pedagogical exercise, does not diminish the document. It contextualizes it in a way that actually makes it more interesting. Think about what it means for a document to be a school text. Every educated person in Mesopotamia who passed through a scribal school learned this document. They wrote it out, probably multiple times, under the supervision of a teacher who corrected their wedge marks. They internalized the structure. Kingship descends from heaven, is vested in one city, moves when that city falls, sweeps through 5 cities and 8 kings to the flood, then resumes in Kish and moves through dozens of dynasties down to the present. This is the structure of a political cosmology, taught to every literate person. It says, there is always one city that holds the kingship, one legitimate ruler, one seat of divine authority. The structure of governance is singular, not plural, because the gods ordained it that way. Even when a city is defeated and the kingship moves, it remains singular. There is always a rightful holder. For any city that wants to claim that it is the rightful holder of the kingship, the city that has inherited the divine mandate from the beginning, the King List is the argument. If your city is on the list, you are legitimate. If it isn't, you're a footnote at best, invisible at worst. The list's omission of Lagash, a city we know was important from excavation and inscription, is not an oversight. It is an editorial choice made by people who are constructing an argument about who has the right to rule. But the document's use as political propaganda does not exhaust its meaning. Political propaganda is most effective when it taps into beliefs that the audience already holds. The King List worked as a political argument precisely because the people who read it already believed in the divine origin of kingship, already understood time in terms of cosmic cycles, already accepted the flood as a historical and theological fact, already had a framework of sacred mathematics into which the numbers fit. The political argument is the surface. The cosmological framework is the substrate, and the substrate is much older than any particular dynasty's use of it. In the 2nd century BCE, roughly 1,700 years after the weld-blundell prism was made, a Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote a history of Babylon in Greek for a Greek-speaking audience. The work is called the Babyloniarcha. It does not survive in full. We have only fragments, preserved in the writings of later Greek and Roman historians who quoted it. But what Berossus preserved is recognizable. A king list of antediluvian rulers, with enormously long reigns, followed by a flood, followed by the historical period. Berossus lists 10 kings before the flood, not 8 as in the weld-blundell prism, but 10, which matches some other versions of the Sumerian tradition. His kings have different names from those in the Sumerian list. The tradition has been filtered through Akkadian and then through Greek, which changes names significantly, and his total for the pre-flood period is 432,000 years, not 241,200. But the structure is identical. Berossus was writing for Greeks. He knew his audience would be skeptical of 432,000-year reigns. He included them anyway. This is significant. The tradition was so important, so established, so much a part of what it meant to transmit Babylonian wisdom to a new audience, that it could not be trimmed to make it more palatable. Berossus, writing in the Hellenistic period, in a world that had absorbed Greek rationalism and would soon produce the first systematic chronologies, still included the antediluvian kings with their impossible reigns. He felt a commitment to honor the ancient heroes in the age-old manner. There is something admirable in that. 400 years before the Common Era, a Babylonian priest in Greek clothing chose to transmit a tradition he knew would look strange to his audience, rather than modernize it into something more credible. He understood that the strangeness was the point. What was the point? What was Berossus trying to say by including the 432,000 years? He was saying, before the world as you know it, there was a different kind of world. A world in which the intervals between significant events were vast. A world in which wisdom was held by beings who were not quite human. A world in which the divine was close to the surface of things, before the flood covered it over, and we were left with the world we know, shorter, faster, more mortal, more confused. The flood is the boundary. On one side, the vast, the divine, the patient. On the other, us. The document is an elegy for a world it cannot describe directly, because no one who remembered it firsthand left a written record. All it can do is say, it was long, it was very long, and then it was over. There is one more layer worth adding to the reinterpretation, and it is the one that connects the document most directly to the experience of its own time.
Maintain the rhythm, boys.
The King List was probably compiled in
The
its
harvest
written
records
form
are due
during
by
the
month's
third dynasty of the Ur III period, roughly 2100 to 2000 BCE, a time of Sumerian political revival and consolidation after a period of Akkadian dominance. The Akkadian Empire, which had been the first true empire in history, had collapsed under pressure from climate change and the invasions of the Gutian people from the Zagros Mountains. The Sumerians, under kings like Ur-Namma and his son Shulgi, reasserted themselves. They built new temples. They reformed the legal system. Ur-Namma's law code is one of the oldest surviving law codes in the world, predating Hammurabi's by 3 centuries. They commissioned great literary works. The King List was part of this revival. It was a cultural argument made at a moment of cultural vulnerability. A claim that Sumerian civilization had always been the center, the origin, the legitimate holder of the divine mandate, even when it seemed otherwise. The pre-flood period with its impossibly long reigns is not just a cosmological statement. It is a political one. We have been here longer than anyone. Our claim to the kingship goes back further than any rival can reach. The gods have been with us since before the flood. Whatever happened in between, whatever empire came and went, we are the continuation of the unbroken line. This is the thing about political propaganda that is sometimes underappreciated. It is most effective when it is also true in the ways that matter. The Sumerians were the oldest literate civilization in the region. Their cities were genuinely ancient. Their traditions were genuinely deep. The King List was making a claim that was, in its essentials, accurate, even if it expressed that accuracy through numbers that no one was meant to take as literal year counts. The document is propaganda, and it is also testimony, both at once. The clay holds both. There is another document, a cuneiform tablet found in the ruins of ancient Uruk in 1959, now catalogued as W2030.7, called the Uruk List of Kings and Sages. It is not as famous as the weld-blundell prism. Most general accounts of the Sumerian King List do not mention it, but it does something the King List itself does not. It pairs each of the 7 pre-flood kings with a specific advisor, and those advisors are unlike anything else in ancient literature. In Sumerian, they are called Abkalu, usually translated as sages or wise ones. In Akkadian, they appear as Abgal. The 7 pre-flood Abkalu are described in a tradition preserved by the Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek around 290 BCE, as beings who emerged from the Persian Gulf, the Erythraean Sea in his account, part fish and part man. Every morning they came up from the water, taught human beings writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, and the arts of building, and every evening they returned to the sea. The first of them, who served King Alulim of Eridu, was named Uana. In Berossus's Greek version, he is called Oannes. Berossus describes him as having the form of a fish, but with the head of a man beneath the fish's head, and feet emerging from beneath the fish's tail. A figure you can see carved into the walls of Assyrian palace reliefs, dressed in a fish skin cloak, carrying the ritual bucket and cone. These figures appear throughout Mesopotamian art. They are not decorative, they are guardians of wisdom, buried beneath doorways and walls in sets of 7 clay figurines to protect buildings and their inhabitants. Here is what the tradition says. Before the flood, each pre-flood king had one of these beings as an advisor. The king provided political authority. The Apkallu provided wisdom, a wisdom understood to be non-human in origin, brought up from the Apsu, the deep freshwater ocean beneath the earth that the god Enki inhabited. The pair, king and sage, was the governing unit of the pre-flood world. That is why the reigns were so long. The kings were guided by wisdom that exceeded human understanding. After the flood, no more Apkallu, the fish sages returned to the water, or were recalled there by Enki, or simply stopped coming. The tradition is inconsistent on the mechanism, but it is consistent on the consequence. After the flood, kings no longer had divine advisors. They had scholars, umanu, human scholars, men who had studied the traditions the Apkallu left behind, who could approximate wisdom without embodying it. Gilgamesh, according to one tradition, is the first king in history to have a fully human advisor. Gilgamesh, 126 years. No fish sage, only a man. This is not the scholarly mainstream. The mainstream reading of the Apkallu tradition is that it represents a mythological explanation for the origins of civilization. The idea that writing, law, and agriculture were too complex to have been developed by humans gradually, that they must have been taught by beings wiser than humans. The fish sage is a theological answer to an archaeological question. How did cities appear so quickly? The Apkallu embody the sudden knowledge theory. Whether that theory is literal or metaphorical depends on what you think about the nature of ancient Mesopotamian thought. But hold the fish man in your mind, the one who came up from the Gulf each morning and taught Alulim everything a first king needed to know. We come back to him. We travel east now, far east, across the distance that Mesopotamian traders sometimes crossed, to a different tradition with a different set of enormous numbers. In the Hindu cosmological tradition, time is not linear, it cycles. The universe passes through vast ages called yugas, each one shorter and morally diminished from the one before, until the final age ends in dissolution and the cycle begins again. The 4 yugas are Satya Yuga, the age of truth and perfection, lasting 1,728,000 years. Treta Yuga, the Silver Age, lasting 1,296,000 years. Dwapara Yuga, the Bronze Age, lasting 864,000 years. And the Kali Yuga, the current age, the age of darkness and moral confusion in which we find ourselves, lasting exactly 432,000 years. The total of the 4 yugas is 4,320,000 years. And the Kali Yuga, the shortest and darkest, is 432,000 years. Compare this to the Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek around 290 BCE, giving a version of the pre-flood king list with 10 kings ruling for a combined total of 432,000 years. Not 241,200, as in the weld-blundell prism, but 420 sars, 120 sars. The Kali Yuga in Hindu cosmology, 432,000 years. The total pre-flood period in Berossus, 432,000 years. Separated by a subcontinent, centuries of independent cultural development, different languages, different mythologies, and the same number at the center of their understanding of time before the current era. If you're still with me at this hour, I am curious about something. Which of these ancient traditions reached you first as a child? Was it the flood story from the Bible? Something from Hindu tradition? The Epic of Gilgamesh in a school book somewhere? Or did you arrive here without a previous map, purely out of curiosity about what a 4,000-year-old clay prism in Oxford has to say? Leave it below if you feel like it. I read every one in the mornings, and they are always the most interesting part of my day. Now, the Norse tradition. The Norse afterlife of the honoured dead, Valhalla, is described in the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda in very specific numerical terms. Valhalla has 540 doors. Through each door, 800 warriors will march on the day of Ragnarok. 540 times 800, 432,000. The army of the honoured dead, the warriors gathered by Odin across all of human history, 432,000. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow rotation of the Earth's axis that completes one full cycle over roughly 25,920 years, produces this number at every turn. 25,920 divided by 60 is 432. Multiplied by 10 is 4,320. By 100 is 43,000. By 1,000 is 432,000. The mythologist Giorgio de Santillana and the astronomer Hertha von Dechend, in their dense and strange 1969 book Hamlet's Mill, argued that these repeated numbers across ancient traditions are evidence that the precession of the equinoxes, known only to careful astronomical observers, discoverable only through generations of meticulous skywatching, was encoded into myth precisely because myth was the most reliable transmission technology available. You could not write numbers on durable material in 5000 BCE. You could not build a library that would survive earthquakes and floods and the burning of cities. But you could tell a story. You could build the numbers into a king's reign. You could make the list sacred enough that scribes would copy it generation after generation. This interpretation, while not accepted by mainstream Assyriology, belongs to a long and serious scholarly conversation about the relationship between astronomical observation and mythological structure. It is not pop archaeology. It is a contested but serious academic tradition. The mainstream holds that the similarities in numbers are coincidence or the result of shared mathematical bases. The counter-argument holds that coincidence of this precision, across this many cultures, is harder to believe than transmission. What we know for certain, the Sumerians were extraordinary astronomers. They tracked the movements of planets across centuries. They identified 5 planets by name. They developed the zodiac. They calculated the synodic periods of Venus with a precision that would not be matched in the Western tradition for more than 1,000 years. Whatever the numbers in the King List mean, the people who chose them understood the sky. One more wave before we go deep. The Genesis connection is the one that most readers already know, but it is worth looking at carefully, because the details are stranger than the general parallel suggests. Genesis chapter 5 contains a genealogy of 10 figures from Adam to Noah, 10 patriarchs who lived before the flood. Their ages at death, provided in the text, range from 365 years for Enoch to 969 years for Methuselah. Methuselah is the oldest person in the Bible. His name has become a byword for extreme old age. Compare this to the Sumerian King List's 8 kings living 241,200 years between them. The biblical ages are much shorter, in the hundreds rather than the thousands, but the pattern is identical. A group of figures before a flood who live impossibly long lives, then the flood, then figures after the flood whose lifespans are shorter, and a gradual decline toward ordinary human mortality. The biblical tradition and the Sumerian tradition share the same structure. Given that the Sumerian tradition predates Genesis by centuries, and given that the ancient Israelites lived in close proximity to and cultural exchange with Mesopotamia, The Babylonian exile alone would have ensured deep familiarity with Mesopotamian literature. The direction of influence seems clear to most scholars. Genesis draws on the Mesopotamian tradition, translating it into its own theological framework. But here is the detail that rarely makes it into the popular account. If you remove Adam and Noah from the biblical list, the first man and the flood survivor, who hold unique roles in the narrative, you are left with 8 figures, 8 patriarchs, as opposed to the biblical count of 10, 8 patriarchs in the same structural position as the 8 pre-flood kings of the Sumerian King List. This observation was made by the biblical scholar John Walton, who pointed out that the structural similarity becomes even more pronounced when you strip the two lists down to their comparable elements. Both traditions preserve 8 figures of unusual longevity in the period before a world-resetting flood. The names are different, the numbers are different in scale, the theology is different, the structure is the same. The most parsimonious explanation is that both traditions are drawing on an older shared tradition, an oral or written account of a time before the flood, preserved differently in Mesopotamia and in the Levant, producing different numbers and different names while maintaining the essential architecture: many, long, flood, few, shorter, us. What that older tradition was, whether it was a memory of a real event, a cosmological teaching, a mathematical encoding of astronomical cycles, or some combination of all three, is the question that the prism in Oxford does not answer. It only asks it, in 8 columns of cuneiform, pressing the reed stylus into the wet clay for the last time around 1800 BCE, and then waiting. Let's go down to the last layer now, the deepest part of the question. The Fishman tradition runs deeper than the Apkallu list suggests, and it is worth following into the specifics, because the specifics are where the strange beauty of it lives. Berossus, in his Babyloniaca, describes Oannes, his Greek version of the Sumerian Yuana, in terms so precise that they read almost like an eyewitness account. He says the creature had the form of a fish, but that beneath the fish's head was a man's head, and that from the fish's tail emerged a man's feet. He says that Oannes spent the day among the people of Babylonia, teaching them letters and sciences and arts and the building of cities and temples and laws, and then at evening retired back into the sea. He says that during the day Oannes took no food, for he was a fish, and he says that this continued until other creatures of the same kind appeared. Other creatures, more than one. The 7 Apkallu, one after another, associated with each of the 7 pre-flood kings. The iconography of these beings is visible in the archaeological record, in the Assyrian palaces at Nimrud and Nineveh, which are later than the Sumerian period by more than 1,000 years, but which draw on a continuous artistic tradition. There are bas-relief carvings of figures dressed in fish skin cloaks, carrying the ritual bucket and cone that appears throughout Mesopotamian religious imagery. These are the Apkallu. They are recognizably the same beings Berossus describes, translated into the visual language of the Assyrian court. Small clay figurines of the Apkallu, the fish-cloaked sages, were buried beneath the floors and walls of Mesopotamian buildings as protective deposits. When archaeologists excavate ancient houses and palaces in Iraq, they sometimes find these figurines at the threshold, or at the corners of rooms, or beneath doorways, 7 of them in a set. The 7 sages protecting the building from evil. The tradition survived not only in texts but in actual ritual practice for thousands of years after the pre-flood period it supposedly describes. What were these beings in the Sumerian understanding? They were the holders of the Mi, a Sumerian word that is notoriously difficult to translate, but which encompasses something like the divine laws, or the fundamental principles that make civilization possible. The Mi included things like kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, and ascent from it, craftsmanship, music, wisdom, scribal arts, and dozens of other concepts that the Sumerians understood as the basic building blocks of human life. The me were not invented by humans. They were held by the gods, specifically by Enki in his domain at Eridu, in the Apsu beneath the earth. The Apkallu were the carriers of the me from the divine realm to the human world. Before the flood, this transfer was direct. Each morning, Yuana came out of the water and taught the first king. The me flowed from Enki through Yuana to Alulim to the civilization that Alulim ruled. This is why the civilization of the pre-flood era was so long and so stable, because it was sustained by direct divine instruction. The king's long reign was not his own achievement. It was the achievement of the wisdom being poured into him every day from the freshwater spring. After the flood, no more Apkallu. The direct line was severed. Humans were left with what the Apkallu had taught, encoded in texts and traditions and ritual practices, but without the beings who had embodied that knowledge. The scholars who came after, the Umanu, the court scholars and scribes, were human beings who had studied the texts. They could approximate, they could transmit, but they were not the source. This is a story about the loss of a living tradition, about the gap between having a teacher and having a text, about what it means to learn from a book rather than from a being. Every civilization has some version of this story, the sense that something was once known more directly, held more fully, and that what we have now is a copy of a copy of a copy, moving further from the original with each generation. The Sumerians encoded that feeling in their king list. The pre-flood kings had fish sages. We have scholars. The fish sages were not human. The scholars are only human. And the reigns get shorter because the wisdom gets thinner. Let me trace one more wave before we rest in the deepest chamber. The tradition of decreasing lifespans is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears in a remarkably consistent form across multiple ancient cultures, and the consistency deserves attention. In the Greek Hesiodic tradition, the world has passed through 4 ages or races. The golden race, created by the gods, who lived like gods and died in gentle sleep. The silver race, inferior to the golden, who lived as children for 100 years. The bronze race, terrible and violent. And the iron race, which is us, the present age, in which justice has fled and nothing is as it should be. The gods lived among the golden race. They retreated through each subsequent age. Now they are gone. The structure is identical to the Sumerian King List in its essentials, an original era of great duration and divine proximity, followed by diminishing eras, ending in the present, which is ordinary, mortal, and severed from the direct presence of the divine. In the Iranian Zoroastrian tradition, the world passes through 4 millennia of 3,000 years each, 12,000 years total. And in the first 3,000 years, the world existed in a purely spiritual, perfect state, before the invasion of evil introduced mortality and limitation. In the Chinese tradition, the sage kings who ruled in the earliest period of Chinese history, the Yellow Emperor, Yao Shun, lived with extraordinary virtue and ruled for extraordinary periods. Their successors are progressively more human, more limited, more subject to political failure. The pattern is global, a golden era of long duration, gradually contracting toward the ordinary, the divine presence progressively withdrawn, the current age always the smallest and most impoverished of the sequence. Why does this pattern appear so consistently? The mainstream anthropological view is that it reflects a universal human tendency to idealize the past, to believe that things were better before, that what we have now is a diminishment from what once was. This is almost certainly part of the explanation. But the consistency of the specific numbers, the 432,000 years that appears in both Berosus and the Hindu Kali Yuga, the 43,200 that appears in the Sumerian list, and as a factor of Hindu cosmological time, the base 60 mathematics that connects Sumerian astronomy to the Hindu tradition, to the Norse tradition, to the Greek tradition, points towards something more than a universal
Okay, the
psychological
transition is
tendency.
clear at this point.
It points
I'm taking a
toward the
sample from the
transmission
lower
of
stratum
specific
now.
knowledge, astronomical knowledge,
So right
encoded
here,
in the
this
language of
darker
myth
ochre
and
layer
king list
clearly
and
indicates
sacred
the Uruk
narrative,
transition. We must
preserved
be
across
extremely
cultures and
careful tracing
millennia
this interface.
because the encoding was robust enough to survive the loss of the context that originally explained it. The precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year wobble of the Earth's axis, was knowable to any culture that made careful astronomical observations over long periods of time. You do not need a telescope. You need generations of careful sky watchers, noting the position of the rising sun against the background stars at the same point in the year, across centuries, until the drift becomes detectable. The Sumerians were making exactly this kind of careful long-term observation. They may have known about precession. They may have encoded it in their sacred numbers. If the number 3600, the Sar, encodes the 3600-year period associated with one particular astronomical cycle, or the sexagesimal rendering of a larger precession-related number, then the 28,800 years of Alulim's reign is 8 times that cycle. The 43,200 of Enmenluana is 12 times it. The 241,200 total of the pre-flood period is 67 times it, or very close to 67. The numbers are not self-evidently astronomical. Scholars who have tried to make them fit the precession cycle or other astronomical periods have found the fit incomplete, but the direction of the inquiry is not absurd. The Sumerians were rigorous astronomers. The numbers are precise sexagesimal mathematics. The combination invites the question, even if it does not yet produce a definitive answer. And the question may be the point. A document that is still generating serious scholarly inquiry 4,000 years after it was pressed into clay has earned something. Not certainty, but persistence. It has earned the right to keep being asked. Before we leave the pattern journey and descend into the deep chamber, one detail from the document itself deserves a closer look. The transition between the antediluvian period and the post-diluvian period at Kish. The first king of Kish, after the flood, is Gishur, who rules for 1,200 years. He is followed by a sequence of kings with names that sound unlike most Sumerian names. Names that some scholars have suggested may preserve memories of a non-Sumerian population in the Kish region, possibly connected to the Semitic-speaking peoples who were present in northern Mesopotamia from an early date. The dynasty of Kish is, in the view of some scholars, a record of an actual historical transition, the movement of political power from the Sumerian south to the region of Kish in the north, preserved through the accretion of legendary numbers around historical names. What is certain is that after the dynasty of Kish, the list becomes progressively more anchored to the historical record. The kings of Uruk include names that appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The kings of Ur include names that appear on actual seals found in actual graves. The famous royal cemetery of Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, contained the graves of kings and queens whose names appear in some versions of the King List. Woolley found the burial of a queen named Puabi, whose grave goods included a spectacular headdress of gold leaves and lapis lazuli and carnelian beads, a lyre decorated with the head of a bull, and the bodies of her attendants, who had apparently gone to their deaths voluntarily at her side. The grave dates to approximately 2600 BCE, placing it in the early dynastic III period, which the King List covers in its post-flood dynasties. This is the point at which the document stops being cosmological and starts being historical. Not cleanly, not at a single line, but gradually, the way the light changes at the edge of a room, not abruptly but by degrees. The numbers get shorter, the names become verifiable, the cities become excavatable, and the world the document describes begins to look like the world the archaeologists have found. The document spans that transition without comment. It does not say, "Here ends myth, and here begins history." It uses the same format, king, city, years, for Alulim at 28,800, and for the kings whose graves Woolley found. The list insists that these are the same kind of thing. The divine origin of kingship, which the opening sentence announces, does not expire when the numbers become realistic. Kingship is still understood as a divine institution in the historical period. The transition from 28,800 to 30 years is a change in scale, not a change in kind. This matters because it tells us how the Sumerians understood the relationship between myth and history. For them, there was no sharp boundary. The divine interpenetrated the historical at every level. The king of Ur in 2600 BCE was still the holder of the divine mandate that had descended from heaven in the days of Alulim. The tradition was unbroken. The institution was continuous. The numbers just changed. The comparison between the Genesis patriarchs and the Sumerian pre-flood kings has been studied extensively since the Sumerian King List was first translated in the early 20th century, and the scholarly literature on the relationship between the two traditions is substantial and ongoing. But there is a specific detail in the comparison that is rarely highlighted, and that changes how you understand both traditions. In Genesis 5, the genealogy of Adam to Noah, the ages given are ages at death, the total lifespan of each patriarch. Methuselah lives 969 years. Adam lives 930 years. The ages at which they father their first sons are also given, and these ages are considerably shorter, often in the range of 60 to 200 years. The text is building a specific picture. These men lived very long lives, but they were not just long-lived, they were productive across most of that long life. They fathered children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren across centuries. In the Sumerian King List, the numbers represent reigns, not lifespans. We do not know how long the pre-flood kings lived. We know how long they held power. This is a different kind of record, measuring a different kind of fact. A lifespan is biological. A reign is political and cosmic. The Sumerian tradition is making an argument about the duration of institutional power. The Genesis tradition is making an argument about biological longevity. Both reach toward the same idea, that people before the flood were different from people after it, but through different categories. When you align the two lists by function rather than by literal content, the Sumerian pre-flood kings as holders of cosmic power, the Genesis patriarchs as embodiments of biological longevity, the parallel becomes more interesting than a simple numerical comparison. Both traditions are trying to say, before the flood, the gap between the human and the divine was smaller. In Sumer, this is expressed as the duration of kingship. The office held longer because the connection to heaven was more direct. In Genesis, it is expressed as the duration of a life. People lived longer because their biological nature was less compromised, closer to the original creation. The same intuition, approached from different directions, using the tools available to each tradition. And then there is this. The Genesis list includes the line, in 6:4, that the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also after that. The Nephilim, beings of great size and power, the children of the sons of God and the daughters of men. This is precisely the figure that the Apkallu tradition addresses in its own way. In the Sumerian tradition, the pre-flood kings had semi-divine advisors who were part fish and part man. In the Genesis tradition, the pre-flood period was inhabited by beings who were part divine and part human. The structures are parallel, the specific forms are different, but the underlying claim that the boundary between divine and human was permeable before the flood, in a way it is not now, is the same claim. After the flood in Genesis, the Nephilim are mostly gone. The long-lived patriarchs are replaced by people with normal lifespans. The world has contracted. After the flood in the Sumerian tradition, the Apkallu have returned to the water. The rains grow shorter. The world has contracted. Whatever the source of these parallel traditions, shared cultural memory, astronomical encoding, independent but convergent theological intuition, or some combination, they are pointing in the same direction. The flood is a hinge. On one side, larger. On the other, us. 5 cities named in the pre-flood king list are not abstractions. They have been dug. Eridu, the first city, where Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, is now a low mound called Abu Shahrain in the province of Dikar in southern Iraq. Iraqi and British archaeologists excavated it between 1946 and 1949, and what they found beneath the surface was unlike most archaeological sites. Beneath the most recent occupation layers, they found the 18 successive temple structures, 18, stacked one atop the other, over roughly 3,000 years of continuous religious practice. Each new temple built on the leveled remains of the last, but following the same fundamental plan. A cult room, a raised platform, an offering table in the same location, generation after generation after generation. This is not unusual for Mesopotamian religious sites. What is unusual is the depth of the continuity. The earliest temple at Eridu dates to approximately 5300 BCE, making it one of the oldest religious structures in the world. The city as an inhabited settlement may go back even further, to the Ubaid period, around 5400 BCE. For the ancient Sumerians, Eridu was not just the oldest city, it was the first one, the place where civilization began, the place where Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water and magic, established his domain in the Apsu. The Apsu at Eridu was not metaphorical. Beneath the southern Iraqi plain, freshwater springs rise to the surface near the ancient site. The Sumerians understood these springs as the visible boundary of Enki's domain, the place where the freshwater ocean beneath the world touched the surface. When they built their temple at Eridu, they built it above the spring. When the Apkallu emerged from the water to teach the first king, they emerged from the spring that Enki inhabited. The archaeological reality of Eridu is consistent with its mythological importance. This was a place that humans found significant for reasons that preceded any written record. The temples they built there, the offerings they made, the continuous occupancy across 3,000 years. All of this suggests that Eridu was understood to be a liminal place, a threshold, a spot where the boundary between the human world and something else was thin. The last city before the flood, Shuruppak, is now Tel Farah in the province of Wasit in Iraq. German and American expeditions excavated it in the early 20th century, and they found something that changed the conversation about the flood narrative in a specific way. At the level of the site corresponding to approximately 2900 BCE, the early dynastic I period, archaeologists found a layer of water-laid silt. Not a thick layer, not the 8-foot flood deposit that Leonard Woolley famously found at Ur and initially, hopefully, announced as evidence of Noah's flood, but a real sediment layer, consistent with a significant local inundation of the Euphrates Valley. A flood. A real one. At the city where the Sumerian flood hero, Ziusudra, was king. The Eridu Genesis identifies Shuruppak as the city where Ziusudra received Enki's warning to build a boat. The king list names Ubar-Tutu as the last king of Shuruppak before the flood. In one version of the tradition, Ubar-Tutu is Ziusudra's father. In another, Ziusudra himself is the last king. Either way, the final pre-flood king was in Shuruppak, and Shuruppak has a flood layer dated to roughly 2900 BCE. Was this the flood? Not in the sense of a global catastrophe, The evidence suggests a severe regional flooding event, the kind of flood that reshapes a river valley, destroys cities, wipes out populations, and leaves enough traumatic memory to generate a tradition preserved for millennia. The southern Mesopotamian plain is extraordinarily flat and extraordinarily vulnerable. The Euphrates and Tigris flood regularly. A particularly catastrophic flood in the 3rd millennium BCE, affecting multiple cities simultaneously, would have felt, to the survivors, like the end of the world. And then, after the water receded, you would rebuild. You would try to remember who had ruled before. You would write it down. And the kings who ruled before the water, who were they? How long had they been there? You had no records. You had only stories. And the stories said, a very long time. A time measured in the units of the stars. A time that could only be described in the language of the gods. Now sit with a different question. Not, did these kings really live 28,800 years? But, what would it mean to be a king for 28,800 years? In the Sumerian understanding, kingship was not a human institution that happened to be ratified by the gods. Kingship descended from heaven, the phrase that opens the list. It was a divine principle instantiated in a human being. The king was not just an administrator. He was the point of contact between the divine order and the human world. He maintained the cosmic arrangements that kept the rivers flowing and the seasons turning and the cities fed. When a king died, if there was no successor, the divine order was at risk. If you are the institution, not just the person, if the king is an office that descends from heaven rather than a man who happens to hold a title, then a reign of 28,800 years is not a lifespan. It is a duration, the duration of an age, an era, a cosmological period. The Apkallu who advised Alulim, who emerged from the Apsu each morning to teach him, was not teaching an individual. He was sustaining a cosmic function. The function lasted 28,800 years, and then the function ended and a new one began, in a new city, with a new king and a new Apkallu. The list is not a list of how long people lived. It is a list of how long the divine office held, in each of its incarnations, before it moved. This reading, the office not the individual reading, is consistent with everything the text says, and does not require any king to have been literally immortal. It requires only that the Sumerians thought about kingship as a cosmic function with a much longer duration than a human life, which they clearly did, which is why they said it descended from heaven, which is why they said after the flood, it descended again. The flood didn't end a person, it ended an era. And after the era ended, the ages shrank. The functions became more human. The Apkallu stopped coming up from the water. The scholars who replaced them were men who had studied the texts the Apkallu had left behind, who could approximate the wisdom without embodying it. The reigns got shorter, not because kings died sooner, but because the cosmic periods grew smaller. Time itself, in the Sumerian worldview, was contracting. There is something in that image that does not leave you easily, a world in which time was once wider than it is now, in which the intervals between significant events were vastly longer, in which the distance between the divine and the human was smaller, because there were creatures who bridged it every day, who came up from the water in the morning and went back in the evening, carrying whatever it is that ancient civilizations understood as wisdom. After the flood, they stopped coming. After the flood, we were on our own. When you stand at the edge of the archaeological site of Eridu, or when you look at photographs taken from above, where the low mound of Abu Shahrain rises barely above the surrounding plain, its edges blurred by centuries of erosion, it is difficult to connect what you see with what the Sumerians believed. The cradle of civilization looks very small from the outside, but the inside is different from the outside, in archaeology as in almost everything else. What the excavations at Eridu found beneath the surface was a record of continuous commitment that the eroded exterior gives no hint of. Those 18 temples, one atop the other, spanning 3,000 years, they were not built by people who were unsure of the importance of what they were doing. Each new temple was built on the rubble of the last, continuing a tradition that was already ancient by the time it was recorded. The first temple at the site, a small mud brick structure from around 5000 BCE, was a shrine to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. The last temples, built 2,500 years later, were still shrines to Enki in essentially the same location, following essentially the same plan. There is something almost geological about this continuity. In most of the world, human institutions do not last 3,000 years without radical transformation. Languages change beyond recognition in a few centuries. Political systems collapse and rebuild. Religious traditions absorb and transform each other. But at Eridu, the architectural plan of the god's house stayed essentially the same for 3 millennia. This is not the behavior of a community that had lost the thread of its tradition. This is a community for whom the thread had never been lost. The Sumerians called Eridu the Abzu, the freshwater deep, the same word they used for Enki's domain beneath the earth. The spring at Eridu, the fresh water that rose from the ground, was understood as a physical manifestation of the Apsu, the subterranean freshwater ocean from which all rivers flowed. To worship at Eridu was to worship at the edge of the divine world, at the place where the underground and the surface met. When the Apkallu emerged from the water to teach the first king, they emerged from the Abzu at Eridu. The spring was the door. Every morning, Uana came through the door and sat with Alulim and taught him. Every evening he went back through the door. The continuity of religious practice at Eridu, 18 temples over 3 millennia, all in the same place, all oriented toward the same spring, was the continuity of that relationship. The temple was built to maintain the door. The 18 rebuildings were 18 renewals of the contract between the human world and the divine world, layer by layer, generation by generation, in the clay that Mesopotamia made from. Now go deeper, below the temples, below the Ubaid period that the archaeologists dated to 5400 BCE. The excavators at Eridu found, beneath the earliest occupation levels they could identify, a layer of sterile sand. Below the sand, more sand. The site of the world's first city sits on a shallow rise above the southern Iraqi plain, surrounded by what was, in the most ancient period, a tidal marsh on the edge of the Persian Gulf. The Gulf has retreated significantly since the earliest human occupation of the region. What is now desert was then a landscape of rivers and marshes and the shallow margins of the sea. The spring at Eridu rose from a water table that was connected, through the porous geology of the delta, to the Persian Gulf itself. The Apsu, in other words, was the Persian Gulf. The Abzu was the aquifer connected to the sea.
This layer, this
When the
deposit of sterile
Apkallu emerged from the water at Eridu, they emerged from a spring that
Sumerian
tasted
King
of the
List.
sea, at the edge of a marshland, in a place that was genuinely liminally situated between land and water. The geography is not metaphor, it was physics. Eridu was the place where fresh water and salt water commingled, where the river met the sea, where the interior of the continent met the open ocean. It was the boundary of the known world in the most literal sense.
It's crucial we
And on that
document every
boundary,
layer.
the tradition said,
This pale band
the
here
divine
and the one
and the
above it
human met.
confirm that the Great Flood
The
was
flood
actually
layer
a
that the
series of devastating
archaeologists found
events.
at Shurupak, dated to approximately 2900 BCE, corresponds to a significant period of Mesopotamian history that scholars sometimes call the Jemdat Nasser, to early dynastic transition. This was a period of major change in the river systems of the Euphrates Valley, a period when the rivers shifted course, when settlements that had been on riverbanks found themselves flooded or stranded, when the geography of the southern Mesopotamian plain changed significantly. Multiple flood deposits have been found at multiple sites in this period. Not a single world-covering deluge, but a pattern of repeated, severe, localized flooding that would, over 2 or 3 generations, feel like the end of the world to the communities experiencing it. The King List's flood line, 3 words in Sumerian, is the literary residue of this period. On one side of the sentence, the world before the flooding. On the other, the world after. The document does not tell you what the flooding meant, because it does not need to. Anyone reading or hearing the document in the Sumerian period would have known. The flood was not a concept. It was a living memory, not of a specific event, but of a specific kind of catastrophe. The kind that resets everything, that erases the records, that leaves the survivors rebuilding from scratch. What did the people of Shuruppak do after the flood receded? They rebuilt, they planted again, they counted again. They asked, who were we before this? Who were our kings? How long did they rule? And the answer they came up with, or that they inherited from an older oral tradition, already preserved through previous floodings, was a very long time. Too long to count in ordinary years. Long enough that it had to be measured in sars and ners and sosses, in the units of the sky. The oral tradition that became the King List may have been trying to do something that is entirely familiar, even in its alien form, trying to hold on to the sense of a world that was larger, more patient, and more directly connected to the divine than the one it was living in. Trying to say, before the water, time was wider. Before the water, wisdom was closer. Before the water, something was possible that is no longer possible. We cannot know if they were right. We cannot know what was lost in the flooding of the southern Mesopotamian plain in the 3rd millennium BCE. We know that civilizations do lose things, that the library at Alexandria was real and is gone, that the oral traditions of countless peoples who left no written record are simply absent from the record. We know that catastrophic events erase not just lives, but the knowledge those lives carried. The King List is an assertion that something was there before the erasure. The numbers are the most the tradition could say about its dimensions. Let's come back to what we can hold in our hands. The weld-blundell prism is real. It exists in Oxford, and you can go and look at it if you choose. It is 20 centimeters tall and 9 centimeters across. It was made of clay from the river systems of what is now southern Iraq. Someone pressed a stylus into it around 1800 BCE. The marks are still there. The cities are real. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, all excavated, all located, all showing evidence of human habitation, extending back thousands of years before the document that records them was written. The flood layer at Shuruppak is real, dated to approximately 2900 BCE, a genuine geological event preserved in the stratigraphy of the site. Gilgamesh is real, in the sense that the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature in the world, was written about a historical figure. We have royal inscriptions and archaeological evidence suggesting a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh, who lived in approximately the 27th century BCE. The King List gives him 126 years. The historical Gilgamesh probably did not live 126 years. But he existed. He built things. People remembered him. What is also real, the scribes who copied this document, the school in which they worked, the tablets they pressed their styli into, the teachers who corrected their marks. There was a tradition of Sumerian scribal education in which young men, and possibly some young women, learned to write by copying texts. The King List was one of the texts they copied. A student somewhere in Mesopotamia, around 2000 BCE or perhaps earlier, wrote out the names and numbers by lamplight or daylight, perhaps not fully understanding what they meant, perhaps understanding perfectly, perhaps somewhere in between. Their hand moved across the wet clay. The marks dried, the tablets survived. Pyotr Mikhailovsky is right that the document is a political charter. It was used to claim legitimacy.
Look at the way the clay
The
was
dynasty
fired.
that commissioned it,
The texture
or the scribal
suggests
tradition
a very
that compiled
specific
it,
origin
wanted
point
to say,
near Sipar.
"We are the inheritors of an unbroken line." That use of the document is clear and well documented. But, and this is the thing that matters most, to make a claim of legitimacy, you have to have an audience that finds the claim credible. The pre-flood numbers were not invented arbitrarily. They were chosen because they meant something. They communicated something about the nature of cosmic time, about the divine origin of kingship, about the scale of what came before, that the audience recognized and accepted. The numbers were in circulation before any particular political dynasty chose to use them. The tradition they encode is older than the document. What that tradition was, in its earliest form, we cannot know. The writing system itself was only invented around 3400 BCE, which means that anything that happened before writing existed is accessible to us only through the memory that survived into the written period. The pre-flood section of the King List is the written record of an oral tradition that reaches back before the writing system existed. The numbers may have been passed down through oral transmission for 1,000 years or more before anyone pressed them into clay. What gets lost in 1,000 years of oral transmission is everything except what people think is essential. The numbers were essential. The most honest answer to the question in the title of this document, "Why do these kings reign for 28,000 years?" is probably a composite. The numbers encode sacred mathematical units based in the sexagesimal system. They are organized around the Sa, the fundamental unit of cosmic time as the Sumerians understood it. They may preserve memories of astronomical cycles, the precession of the equinoxes, the great year, the numbers that appear in Hindu and Norse traditions as well. They serve a political function in the document's historical context, and they communicate something about the Sumerian understanding of the relationship between divine and human time. The belief that before the flood, the divine was closer, the periods longer, the wisdom more direct. None of these explanations is complete. All of them are true in some sense. And there is one more thing that remains true regardless of interpretation. The
This prism,
gradual
discovered
shrinkage
in the early
is the
20th
most
century,
human
is
moment in the
crucial as it
entire
lists
document.
the kings of Sumer
It does
and the
not need to
precise
be
lengths of
explained.
their ancient reign.
It is simply observed. Before the flood, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. After the flood, 1,500 years, 1,200 years, 900 years. Gilgamesh, 126 years. And eventually, 30 years, 20 years, names without numbers, names without cities, names that appear to be historical and ordinary and forgotten. A civilization slowly forgetting how to live forever. The document does not comment on this. It does not mourn it. It simply records it. One king, one city, one number, one flood, and then the world as we know it, getting smaller and faster and more ordinary with every reign. Whatever the fish sages taught Lulim on the banks of the freshwater spring at Eridu, whatever it was that made the first era last 28,800 years, that knowledge went back into the water after the flood. The scholars who came after did their best. They wrote it down. They copied what they had. The student pressed the stylus into the clay by lamplight and transcribed the numbers they had inherited from people who had inherited them, from people who might have understood what they meant. We are the inheritors of the inheritance. We look at the prism in the glass case in Oxford, and we turn it with our eyes the way it was once turned on its wooden spindle, column by column, king by king, city by city, flood, and then us. Let us be precise about what the evidence supports, and honest about what it does not. The Sumerian King List is a real document. The weld-blundell prism is a real object. The cities it names are real places. The scribal tradition that produced it was a real educational and cultural institution. The document was copied across at least 3 centuries, preserved in at least 25 versions, taught in schools, used in political arguments, and consulted by later traditions, including the Babylonian tradition that Berossus inherited and transmitted to the Greeks. Gilgamesh is almost certainly a historical figure, in the sense that there was probably a king of Uruk in the 27th century BCE named Gilgamesh, who built walls and made himself famous enough to be remembered across 3,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is both the oldest surviving work of literature and the most sophisticated ancient treatment of the theme of mortality, was written about a real city and a real king. His 126 years in the King List is not a historical record, it is a traditional attribution, but it is the kind of attribution that preserves a memory of historical reality. The flood is almost certainly a real event, or a cluster of real events. The geological and archaeological evidence for severe flooding in the southern Mesopotamian plain in the early 3rd millennium BCE is solid. The flood deposits at multiple sites, the shift in settlement patterns, the disruption of the political landscape, all of this is archaeologically documented. Whether any single flood event was dramatic enough to generate the cultural memory encoded in the King List, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Eridu Genesis, and eventually the biblical narrative of Noah is impossible to determine. What is clear is that flooding was a real and recurring part of life in the Euphrates Valley, and that the communities there experienced it as genuinely catastrophic at various points in their history. The numbers in the pre-flood section are not literal lifespans. This is the mainstream scholarly consensus, and it is correct in the sense that no human being has ever lived 28,800 years. Whether the numbers encode astronomical cycles, sacred mathematics, political claims, pedagogical exercises, or some combination of all 4, is an open question on which scholars continue to disagree. The Apkallu tradition, the fish sages, is a genuine element of Sumerian and Babylonian religion and not a later invention. The iconography is documented in archaeological finds across a period of more than 2 millennia. The texts that describe the Apkallu are multiple, consistent, and serious. Whatever the Apkallu were, whether they were understood as literal beings, as metaphors for a kind of wisdom, as ritual figures whose stories preserve teachings about the origin of civilization, they were not peripheral to Sumerian thought, they were central to it. The parallels between the Sumerian King List and the Genesis patriarchs, between Berossus's numbers and the Hindu yugas, between the number 432,000 and the Norse calculation of the warriors of Valhalla, these are real, they are documented, they have generated a serious scholarly literature. Whether they reflect astronomical encoding, shared cultural transmission, or coincidence is genuinely contested, and the honest position is that we don't know. What we know is that the document exists, that it asks a question about time and divinity and the loss of something, and that 4,000 years later it is still asking that question. The scribe who pressed those marks into clay in 1800 BCE could not have imagined that the object
As
they
we
were
can
making
see from the
would end
markings,
up in a glass
the
case in
progression of the
Oxford,
early rain lengths
examined by
is quite
scholars from
remarkable.
every part of the world, still generating arguments about what the numbers mean. But the clay survived, the marks survived, the question survived. The gradual shrinkage from 43,200 years to 126 years to 30 years to 10 years to the historical period, this trajectory is the most human thing in the document, and it requires no interpretation beyond what it is. It is the record of a tradition observing itself becoming more ordinary. It is a civilization writing down its own loss of scale, its own compression from the vast to the particular. Whatever the tradition believed caused that compression, the flood, the withdrawal of the fish sages, the natural contraction of cosmic cycles, the inevitable diminishment of divine proximity, it believed the compression was real. It watched it happen across its own history. It wrote it down. And it left us a question. Not just, why do these kings reign for 28,000 years, but the deeper one beneath that. What do we do with the knowledge that the world was once understood to be larger, stranger, and more intimately connected to its origins than it is now? The question is not answerable. It is livable. The people who made this document lived with it. The scribes who copied it lived with it. Berossus carried it across a cultural boundary and gave it to the Greeks. Someone pressed it into clay for us. The question can wait until morning, but the clay remembers it. The document leaves you with a number of things that are genuinely uncertain, and it is worth naming them plainly, rather than dressing them in more confidence than the evidence supports. We do not know when the oral tradition behind the King List began. The document was compiled in written form around 2100 BCE, but the tradition it preserves is almost certainly older than the writing system itself. How much older is impossible to determine. The pre-flood cities mentioned in the list have occupation layers going back to 5400 BCE, and some of the names, Alulim, Alalngar, appear in no other context and cannot be traced to any later tradition, which suggests they are very old. But very old cannot be quantified. We do not know what the scribes who copied the King List believed about the numbers. Some of them may have taken the pre-flood reigns as literal historical facts. Some may have understood them as symbolic. Some may not have thought about the question at all. They were copying a school text, getting the wedge marks right, satisfying the requirements of their education. The internal mental state of a Sumerian scribal student, around 2000 BCE, is not recoverable. We do not know whether the Apkallu were understood as literally real beings or as mythological constructs. Mesopotamian religion had a complex relationship between what we might call literal belief and what we might call symbolic or ritual truth. A Sumerian worshipper who burned offerings to Enki was not necessarily asserting that a god physically lived beneath the spring at Eridu. The relationship between the ritual act and the ontological claim was more nuanced than that. The same may be true of the Apkallu. Whether Berossus believed that a creature that was literally half fish had literally emerged from the Persian Gulf every morning to teach the first king is impossible to know. What we can say is this: the document presents a coherent picture of a past that was qualitatively different from the present in specific ways. The past was longer, the divine was closer, the wisdom was more direct, the kings were more stable. The flood ended that era. What came after was still governed by the same divine mandate, but at a smaller scale, with less direct access to the source. This picture is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears, in different forms, in enough ancient traditions that it seems to represent a widespread human intuition. The intuition that the present is diminished from a past that was greater. Whether that intuition is accurate, whether there actually was a golden age of greater divine proximity, is not something archaeology can determine. What archaeology can determine is that the intuition was held, expressed and preserved with extraordinary care by the people of ancient Mesopotamia, and that the document they made to preserve it is still here, in a glass case in Oxford, asking us what we think. The question is not answered, it is offered. That is what the clay has always been doing, not asserting, not claiming, offering the question, in 8 columns of wedge marks, waiting for whoever turns the spindle next. The scribes did their work. We have received it. Whatever comes next is ours to press into whatever material we have available and hope it survives. The question of what the scribes themselves believed about the pre-flood kings is one that admits no clean answer, and the impossibility of a clean answer is itself informative. We know that the scribal tradition of ancient Mesopotamia was capable of sophisticated, self-aware literary production. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not a naive document. It addresses the problem of mortality with a directness and emotional intelligence that has not been surpassed in 3,000 years of subsequent literature. The lament literature of ancient Sumer, texts like the Lament for the Destruction of Ur, which describes the fall of the third dynasty of Ur in terms of genuine grief and sophisticated understanding of political causation, shows a tradition that could think clearly and critically about events, even when those events were filtered through a theological framework. The scribes who copied the King List were educated in this tradition. They knew the literature. They knew the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is about a king who appears in the King List and who fails to find the immortality that the pre-flood kings apparently possessed. They would have noticed the tension. A student who copied the King List in the morning and the Epic of Gilgamesh in the afternoon was holding both documents in their hands, the one that said Gilgamesh ruled for 126 years and the one that said earlier kings ruled for 43,200, the one that recorded the divine mandate of kingship, and the one that described a king's desperate and failed search for the immortality that mandate no longer provided. What did that student think? We cannot know. We have no diaries, no personal letters, no records of informal conversation from this period. What we have are the copies they made, and the copies are faithful. The numbers were not changed. The flood line was not annotated. The document was reproduced as received, generation after generation, by people who understood what they were copying and chose to copy it exactly. This fidelity is its own form of statement. To copy a document faithfully is to affirm it, not necessarily to believe every claim it makes in the most literal possible sense, but to affirm that the document has value worth preserving, that the tradition it represents is one worth transmitting, that the questions it asks are ones the next generation should also be asked. The 25 copies of the King List that survive are 25 acts of affirmation. 25 times a hand pressed a stylus into clay to say, "This matters. Pass it on." We are the 26th copy, not in clay, not in cuneiform, but in the simple fact of still being interested, still turning the question over, still wondering what the numbers mean, still finding in the diminishment from 28,800 to 126 something that speaks to an experience we recognize even if we cannot name it precisely. The document is still working. 4,000 years later, at this hour, in whatever room you are in, the document is doing the thing it was designed to do, holding a question open, holding it open long enough that you might stay with it through the night. That is, in the end, the most honest description of what the Sumerian King List is. Not a historical record, not a political charter, not a mathematical puzzle. A question, pressed into clay, patient as clay has always been patient, waiting. What would it mean to live in an era that lasted 28,800 years? Not to live for 28,800 years, though the King List implies that too, but to live in an era of that duration. An era in which the pace of change was different, in which what we call progress, what we call history, what we call the acceleration of everything, simply did not exist. An era in which things were built to last not a century but a millennium, not a millennium but 10,000 years, in which the temples at Eridu rose one atop the other over 3,000 years of continuous use, following the same plan because the same plan was working. We live in an era of accelerating everything. The pace of change in the last 200 years exceeds the pace of change in the previous 2,000. The pace in the previous 2,000 exceeded the pace in the 10,000 years before that. We do not know what a life feels like in a slower time. We have no frame of reference for a civilization in which a king's era lasted longer than the entire known span of human civilization. But you have had moments. Not eras, moments. A summer that lasted longer than it should have because you were somewhere particular, somewhere beautiful, or somewhere beloved, or somewhere where the days had a different texture than your ordinary days, and time moved differently. A friendship that went on long enough that you lost track of where it started. A period in your life, a year, 2 years, a decade, that in memory seems to contain more than those years could physically hold. The Sumerian scribe who recorded Alalim's 28,800 years had probably never experienced anything like it, any more than we have. But they preserved the number because someone before them believed it described something real, a quality of time that was different from their time, an era in which the divine was close enough to teach human beings every morning, an era that ended and could not be gotten back. The things in your life that had that quality, the friendships, the places, the seasons, they are not recoverable either, not in the same form. You can visit the city you loved at 23 and it will be a different city, and you will be a different person, and the exact thing that made that time irretrievable will have become, in your memory, a little more like the Sumerian King List, enormous, inexplicably long, more real in recollection than any single event could account for. This is the mirror the prism holds up. Not that we once lived longer, but that the things that mattered have a different duration in memory than they had in time. And the scribes who pressed those numbers into clay were, among other things, doing what scribes always do, trying to preserve the feeling of a duration that was slipping away. Before we let the night have you, a small, optional thing. If tonight felt like the kind of night this channel exists for, the quiet ones, the long ones, the ones where you needed something to drift inside rather than something to consume, a gentle tap-on like helps other quiet people find their way here. The subscribe button is there if you want more nights like this one. And if you feel moved to leave the question from the middle of the night in the comments, where in the world you were, or which ancient tradition reached you first, or what question the prism raised that I didn't answer. I read them all in the mornings, and they are, without exception, the best part of my day. Now, in Oxford, in a room of the Ashmolean Museum, the lights have been off for hours. The prism stands in its glass case, the buff and brown clay, the wedge marks pressed by a hand that has been dust for 4,000 years. 4 sides, each inscribed with 2 columns of a language that nobody speaks anymore. The wooden spindle that once ran through its center is long gone, but the hole is still there, and if you could hold the prism on its spindle in the dark and turn it slowly, the columns would pass through the lamplight one by one. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alaungar, 36,000 years. The flood swept over, and then the world as we know it, getting shorter with every rain, moving toward the ordinary, toward Gilgamesh at 126 years, toward the kings whose names appear on buildings and seals and the edges of history, toward us. The clay can wait until morning. The fish sage has gone back to the water. The question can wait until morning. For now, you can rest. The ancient imagination of a diminished present is not a pathology, it is a diagnostic. Every tradition that looks backward to a golden age is doing something specific. It is naming the things it values that it believes are in short supply. The Sumerians named wisdom, direct, divine, unhurried wisdom, delivered by beings who came from the deep every morning. The Greeks named justice and ease and the presence of the gods. The Hindus named truth and wholeness, the complete expression of Dharma. Whatever was golden in the Golden Age is precisely what the tradition feels it is losing. The long reigns of the antediluvian kings are not a fantasy about immortality. They are a statement about what kind of time is required to do something right. You need 28,800 years to rule well, if the task of ruling well is genuinely vast. If kingship is the maintenance of the cosmic arrangement, the keeping of the me, the holding of the divine mandate, the daily work of being the point of contact between what the gods intend and what humans are able to do, then 100 years is not enough time, not nearly enough. The king who rules for 28,800 years is not a man who happens to be very old. He is an institution that has had enough time to actually work. We are impatient now in ways the ancient world was not. We expect institutions to produce results in years or decades. We measure progress in electoral cycles, in quarterly reports, in the attention span that social media has trained us to expect. We are very good at starting things. We are much less good at being the 18th temple, built on the ruins of 17 others, in exactly the same place, for exactly the same purpose, because the purpose has not changed, and the place has not changed, and the God is still in the spring below. There is a quality in the very old, in people who have lived long enough to watch several cycles complete themselves, that is different from the quality of youth. Not wisdom exactly, though sometimes that. More like patience with the shape of things. A willingness to wait for the turn of something that takes a long time to turn. The elderly person who plants a tree they know they will never sit under. The monk who illuminates a manuscript, knowing the monastery will preserve it for centuries after they are gone. The astronomer who records observations that will only be useful to someone who checks them against records made 100 years hence. The pre-flood kings, in the Sumerian imagination, had that quality magnified beyond any individual human capacity. They had the patience of astronomical time. They had the wisdom of beings who were not quite human, delivered fresh each morning. They had the stability of a world in which things did not change quickly because things were not supposed to change quickly. We don't know how to want that. We have been trained to want speed. But tonight, in the dark, in whatever room you're lying in, you chose something slow. You chose something that takes 2 hours and asks nothing of you except the willingness to follow a thread through 4,000 years of clay without rushing. That is not nothing. That is, in its small way, the 18th temple, the same purpose, the same place, a lamp instead of a fire, but the same darkness around it, and the same question at the center. The prism in Oxford will be there tomorrow. The question it asks will be there tomorrow. If you fall asleep before it answers, and it won't answer, it never does, it only asks more carefully, then the question will still be there when you wake up, patient as clay, patient as Eridu's spring, patient as the fishman going back into the water at the end of the day. That is enough for tonight. That has always been enough.